All right, so I'm here to talk to you about the improved prefab workflows that we brought to Unity 2018.3. Who of you has already used them? Who loves them? Who hates them? Security, can you get this guy? Okay. All right, so let's talk about prefabs. We all know and love the prefabs since forever, but the improvements that I'm going to talk about took a long time to make. Finally, they're here. So when you look at prefabs, before 2018.3, we used to look at prefabs from the perspective of the scene. So a prefab was something that was in the assets, but to modify that prefab, you will normally bring it into the hierarchy, and it will show up as this object with a blue name, and you would make your changes in the scene, and then hit apply in the inspector, and that would be saved to the prefab asset, right? That's how we would make changes to prefabs through the apply button. The problem with the workflow is, even before talking about nested prefabs and all that jazz, the problem with the workflow is it was prone to make mistakes. You would basically bring this instance to the scene, make some changes, maybe you forget, you make some other changes, then you hit the apply button, and suddenly you propagated these changes to everybody in the team with disastrous consequences. So introducing the new prefab workflows. So how do you change prefabs now? Now this is a little demo that I've built. It's actually on the mobile booth if you want to try it out. But now I just want to show you how it works in terms of prefabs. So the first thing you see in Unity 2018.3 or 2019 is this thing in the hierarchy. So the first thing you notice is that now objects have an icon, right? They have an icon because the situation with nesting and with variants has become a bit more complex. So you really need good visibility on what's a prefab, what's not, what's a game object contained in a prefab, and so forth. So in addition to the blue text that you used to for prefabs, you also have these icons. You have the blue icon, the blue box for prefabs. You have this blue box with arrows for variants. I'm going to talk about variants later. And then you have the white box, which is just a regular game object. So for instance, if I were to enable this game object, which is here, this tree, how do I make this into a prefab? Well, just regular stuff. You bring this object, you drag it into the assets, and it gets created as a prefab. So now we have it here. So the first thing you notice here, we don't have the inspection anymore, which is something that some people don't really like. We can't see the properties of the prefab anymore. We need to step in. I will talk about this later if you want, or take it as a question. But as you can see now, we have this open prefab button. So to edit the prefab, sure, we can still do it here in the hierarchy, select the instance that we have in the scene, make some changes, and hit apply. But personally, as Unity, we are now kind of discouraging this approach. We're saying this is prone, this is where you can make mistakes. The nice way to edit prefabs is to step inside. So how do you step inside? You can either select the asset and click this open prefab button. You can go from here with this little arrow button. Or if you have selected the prefab, you can go from the inspector with the open button. Whichever you select, you click it, and now you see the prefab in isolation. This view is called prefab mode. It's an empty scene, it's an empty space where you only see the content of the prefab. So it's isolated, but you can still see the prefab in context in the game view on the side. So if you set up your camera correctly, you can see the prefab in both worlds, which is quite useful. And now you can make your edits in isolation, which means you have much, much more clarity on what you're making. If you're changing some graphic property, you see it straight away. And then you also see how it looks in the scene. So for instance, here I could change, I could change the scale, right? I'm changing it here in the inspector. I could change the mesh that this prefab is using. And you see, as soon as I make the change, the reason I see this thing straight away in the game view is because now we have this feature here. It's called autosave. So basically, I'm making changes to the prefab, and rather than having to apply, the changes are being saved. And keep in mind that when I say save, I don't say it lightly because there's a difference between apply and saving. We save when you're directly editing the asset. Because I'm in prefab mode, I'm actually directly editing the asset, so I'm saving my changes to the asset. When I'm outside of prefab mode and I'm looking at an instance of that asset, I'm applying, right? Because applying means taking those temporary changes and bringing them to the asset. So save is when I'm inside, applying is when I'm outside, and I send those changes to the asset. So yeah, autosave can be turned off from here, and it unveils a save button that you can always click to save. And this might be useful if you're experimenting or if you have such a big prefab that you don't want to save all the time because that slows you down. That's an option. If you don't want to, then by just making changes, they're saved to the prefab. Here you will see also a how do you call it? Breadcrumbs that show me where I'm coming from. So now I'm coming from a scene directly into this prefab. If I had nested prefabs, then you would see these breadcrumbs grow and show me all the steps. So as you dive deeper into a prefab, you see where you're coming from, and you're able to jump at different levels. So if I want to jump back to the scene, I can just click here, and I'm back into the scene. So let me see if I go back to the flow. What I want you to think of is thinking of prefab as boxes. As this thing that is a box, and we temporarily, well, when we make the box, right, when we create a prefab, we're doing this. We have a game object, we apply kind of like a wrapper on top, and that wrapper still shows us the content, still shows us the properties on the outside, right? But it's really useful to think of prefabs as boxes. So when you are using prefab mode, you're stepping inside the box. And in fact, I want to see and reply honestly, who of you noticed what's the root of this prefab? What is this? Is this a prefab? No, that's a game object. So while I'm in prefab mode, because I'm looking at the contents of the box, I actually see the content. So I see the object that I started from, which if you think of prefab as boxes, it makes sense. You have the object, you wrap it inside, you wrap it in the box, open the box, and you see the content. And that's key to understand as you start working with more complexity. So now you also have another possibility, which is in the scene, I can right-click on the prefab, and I have Unpack Prefab and Unpack Prefab completely. Now, in this context, Unpack Prefab is enough. What it does is it removes the wrapping, and then we see the content. If I undo, I'm back to the prefab, and Unpack Prefab completely just means that if you were to have like more prefabs one inside of the other, it removes all of the wrappings. So let me go back to my beautiful animations. Unpacking removes the wrapping and reveals the content of a prefab. So it basically means removing the box, and now you see the content and you see exactly the same properties. Now, I said that the safe way to edit prefab is to step inside and make the changes. But we still have the ability to make changes from here, from the scene view. So if I select the prefab and I go here to the inspector, you will notice the familiar UI of this bold text, right? Bold text means some change have been applied to this prefab in the scene, to this instance of the prefab. And they are called overrides. So if I were to make any change here in the scene, like say, for example, I were to change the mesh again to something else, to another tree, I see the change here, but this change has been registered as an override. You see the bold text, and now we have this little blue line on the side to make it more evident. And then I can make some other changes. Let's say that I don't want it to cast shadows, or maybe I want to cast shadow again, light map static. As I make these changes, I'm basically dirting this instance, and I have all of these overrides. Cool new thing is you will see here you have this new button, which is not apply or revert anymore, but it's called the overrides dropdown. So you open this new UI, and this very comprehensive UI is showing me now the full picture. I have these overrides to a prefab called tree in the context of a scene. So the instance that's in the scene has these overrides. Where does it have the overrides? Well, there's something here on the prefab source. You see the active flag, the static flag has been dirtied, and then I have changes on these, the mesh filter, changes on the mesh renderer. So this really gives you an overview of what's happening here. And then you have more control in the way you want to apply or revert these changes. So you can apply all or revert all from here, or by selecting each component, you can apply or revert from here. So I can apply all the component, revert all the component, or I can right-click on the property and apply the single property down to the very component of the vector 3. So I could potentially apply or revert only, say for example, I change the scale and I could apply only the X scaling to the original asset. So it's really, really powerful. But as I was saying before, at the same time, it gives you a much better overview of what's happening on the prefab and more control of what you want to send to the prefab asset so that you don't really destroy the work of other people in your team. But again, I want to suggest you not to make changes in here. It's better to step into prefab mode. You see the clean asset, and then you make changes in there. So now if I wanted to revert everything, override drop down, reset all, revert all, and then this prefab is now clean. So in the context of this idea of boxes, I like to think of overrides as stickers on top of these boxes. So the idea that you have the box, you're seeing the contents from the outside, and then you decide to make a change that only applies from the outside. So you're basically applying a sticker on top. And that sticker can at any time be removed. So if you look at that, if you look at overrides as stickers, I love this metaphor, as you can see. Revert means removing the sticker, and apply means taking the sticker from the outside, bringing it inside, and when you bring it inside, the sticker is merged with the original source. The original source changed value, and because the outside doesn't have a sticker anymore, then you see the new value from the outside, but not as an override, as a final property. One thing to keep in mind, game objects can't have overrides. I'll give you 1 second to process. This is not something new, actually. This was already happening before. If you had a game object, you made a change, that's final, right? It doesn't stay as an override. And this ports in the new system, exactly the same. So if you have a game object, you change any property, that's final. If you have a prefab, you change any property, that stays as an override. And then you can remove it or apply it, right? So if I go inside here and I make changes from inside the prefab, because this thing now is a game object at the root, if I make changes in prefab mode, like scaling, say for example, you see I change the scaling and it's not bold. It's being immediately applied, actually saved to the source prefab. That's an important distinction to remember. There's a delay in the projection. I want to keep timing in mind. So once you have this thing in place, these boxes, it's easy to go and nest prefabs, right? I can go and grab some rock, for example. I grab this rock prefab, and I literally just drop it into here in prefab mode, and you see the thing is nested because it's parented to the original asset. And as you see, I move the rock, I scale it down, and in here in the scene view, I see the change immediately because I'm on autosave. But now this is a nested prefab, which means that I can totally take this one, and from here, from the hierarchy, I can step inside, and now I'm looking at the rock in isolation, which is contained inside the tree, which is in the scene. Where do I see all of this? Up here in the breadcrumbs, right? I'm editing the rock, which is a prefab inside a prefab called tree, which is a prefab instanced in a scene. So much more context, everything is more clear, and potentially you make less mistakes. If I make changes in here though, these changes are final because I'm looking at the rock, so I'm looking at a game object, right? If I step back and I go back into the tree prefab, if I make changes to this one rock, changes stay as overrides. Right? Because this rock here, inside the context of the tree, is a prefab. I want to slow down because at this point I know it starts to become complicated and you're looking all over the UI. It's very logical, and once you get to try it out, it all falls in place. I'm just giving you a brief overview and sometimes to think about the implications of this system. Of course, as you nest prefabs, and that's something that the team actually experienced. Like, it wasn't as easy as just to create the technology to nest prefabs. That was kind of trivial. But the idea of, like, with these new powers and this new complexity, complexity increases. So we need to give new tools to give more clarity and a better overview of what's happening at any given time. I don't know what I have next. So yes, okay. So now let's say that I have some overrides in the scene that I like. I have this prefab here in the scene, and I made some changes. Let's say that, first thing, let's say that I take this tree with the rock, I duplicate it, and I move it to the side. So now I'm using this prefab everywhere in my scene, and they're all the same. But then, in this particular instance, I like this one. I want the rock to be bigger just here, just in this one. So I change the rock, and as you can see, this rock here doesn't scale, right? Because now these changes are in the scene as overrides. But let's say that I like this prefab, and I want to make a new prefab out of this that encapsulates all of the changes that I made, but still links to the original one. So now I have a new option. I can take this tree, I can drag it into the assets, and Unity proposes me, do you want an original prefab, so a completely independent prefab, or do you want to create what is called a prefab variant? And that's the new option. A variant, you can see it, if you're a programmer, you can see it as inheritance. So you still have the original thing, you made some changes, and you inherit a new prefab that still has all of the things from the original one plus something more. In this case, a change in scaling. So if I say variant, I see here a new asset that has this new icon. Sorry for the low resolution. That has this new icon, which is basically a prefab with two arrows that diverge. So what is this thing? What is this thing? This is a kind of a special box. And if I step inside, what do you expect to find inside? A game object. If I step inside the variant, I find the prefab that I encapsulated. So the original tree, right? Just to recap, I had the tree, which was a prefab, with another prefab inside, that was the rock, right? I took the rock, I made some changes, so I put some stickers on the rock, and then I took all of this and I put it into another box, which is the variant. Right, so now I have this box here. If I step inside, I find my original tree prefab. If I step inside, I find the original tree game object, the one I made at the beginning of the presentation, which now has also a nested prefab, which is a rock. And if I step inside the rock, I see the original game object that comprises this prefab. And as you can see here, the breadcrumbs are showing me all of these steps. So back to the metaphor, variants are, as I said before, normal prefab, stickers on top, I like it, I want to keep it, I close it into another box. So I close it into another box, and this is the variant. Still has a connection to the original one, but it can retain the overrides. Okay. So variants are just basically a wrapper for prefabs. They're not a special type. Like a variant is, in all senses, just a prefab. The only difference between a prefab and a variant is this. The root in a prefab is a game object. The root in a variant is a prefab. That's the only difference. So don't, I know at this point your head is spinning and you're thinking, oh my God, this is super complicated. It's actually very simple. I just wanted to give you an overview of the possibilities. But once you play with it, again, it all falls in place. How much time do I have? I have 5 minutes, says Ali. So let's jump into questions. Do you have questions? And there should be a mic running around. They probably have it. Or, yes, they probably have it. But scream your questions. Sorry? Just one sec. Say again?
What about backward compatibility?
Yeah, so the question is, what about backward compatibility? Technically, it is all backward compatible because as you move your project from any version, potentially 2018.2 is better, to 2018.3 or 19.1, all of your prefabs just get converted into regular prefabs, and then you start building on top. Of course, once you make, for example, once you nest something or you make a variant, you can't really bring it back. But we don't support backporting projects anyway, so that shouldn't be the case. No worries. I can't hear.
Hi. If you change the prefab that is the root of a variant, does that change all of the variants?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's kind of the point, right? Like you, if you make a variant, you want to keep that link to the original one. But I'll show you one cool opportunity that you have. So he said, if you change, let's say I have this tree. This tree is the this prefab is a variant, right? Step inside, I see the original prefab that this variant is encapsulating. And he said, if I change that, does it change in every variant? Yes, it does. If you don't want that, you can potentially disconnect them. So this is a variant, is encapsulating a prefab. If I right-click here and I unpack this prefab, I get the original game object. I broke that connection. And as you can see, this variant is no longer a variant, just a regular prefab, because of what I said before, right? If the root is a game object, it's not a variant. If the root is a prefab, it's a variant. It's a variation on that prefab. So you have this power. You can do that. You can unpack this one. You can make this one another prefab. So you have a lot of potential in just basically opening the box and swapping the contents. Okay. There's one. Ali, there's one there.
Thanks. Hi, your presentation kind of hinted at it, but you can do variants of variants and infinitely in that aspect?
Yeah. I mean, infinitely, it's gonna...
Within a reason.
It's gonna break, but yeah. Yeah, you can totally do that. When you are inspecting a variant, I'm gonna undo that if it works, yes. So when you select a variant, when you select the asset of a variant, here at the top, you will see the base, which means which prefab this variant is encapsulating. And from there, you can go back and you can trace back like the chain of dependencies that you have created. I want to say, don't go crazy, like for your own sanity, because it's not even about the tech. It's about the fact that at some point you're going to lose track and you create a lot of dependencies, right? And at some point somebody wants to touch that prefab and they can't because they know that several steps of variants are depending on that. So maybe at that point it just makes sense to break it into a new one and make it independent. But that's design. That's up to you.
Oh, hello. I have a question about recursion in the nested prefabs, because I have an UI, and inside this UI component, I make like beautiful holders, animations, and I want to apply like in another one of these one. So how the NAS prefabs handle recursion?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? I heard you. Can you hold the microphone closer as well?
Sorry, it's better?
I think so. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you said you have a prefab that you use for UI,
Yeah.
and
And then that prefab, I want to use inside the same prefab. For like, I have a holder for pop-up, for example, and then inside that pop-up, I have another like text area that I want to apply this like the same layout. So how it works? If I, for example, I do a mistake and I apply that's a prefab inside that one.
if you make a mistake and apply,
Yeah.
then I mean, if you apply is kind of like a destructive operation, right? You committed your change into the asset. So if you, in that case, you will need to revert the changes via a version control system or something like that.
Okay.
Is that the question? Or-
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it's like if they have like sort of like damage control about recursion of nested prefabs.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you can do when you're inside prefab mode, as you make changes, even though these changes are auto-saved, while you're still in prefab mode, you can undo. That's also why prefab mode is safer. Because if you're in the scene and you apply, it's done. You save to an asset, and the undos, because they only belong to the scene, are not going to undo that change. But if you're in prefab mode and you're working in here, say for example, yeah, if I make any change in here, I can always undo the changes. So that's one answer, I guess. But if you really save the changes and you exit prefab mode or you're using apply, then to undo them, you really need to use a version control. Cool. Okay, thank you.